Thanks very much, Valerie. Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you here. And we're quite fortunate tonight to have Earle Lockerby to give us a talk. Earle lives in central Ontario, but originally from Hamilton, here on the island. And he's here on visit for 2 weeks. So Doug is a friend of Earle, and he got in touch with him probably a few months ago. Would you give a talk when you're here? Because his topic, the deportation of the Acadians of Prince Edward Island, is the title of one of his books. He is the first one to publish a book on the deportation of the Acadians of Prince Edward Island. And as you'll see, he's well versed in that story. So Earle Lockerby attended school at Hamilton, PEI, and at Kensington. He studied at Mount Allison University, at the Technical University of Nova Scotia, now part of Dalhousie University. He also studied at the Imperial College at London, England, affiliated with the University of London. Has a bachelor degrees in science and engineering, that's far from history, and postgraduate degrees in engineering and in management. He worked for 30 years in the nuclear power industry in Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and he has been retired since 1996, and since he's been very busy researching history. He has been interested in 18th century maritime history, particularly PEI history, most of his adult life, and for the past 30 years has been actively researching and writing in this field. He is the author or co-author of several books. The one I just mentioned, The Deportation of the Prince Edward Island Acadians. There's also a French version of that book. He first published Pathways to the Present, A Social History of Hamilton, PEI. He also published Jeremiah Bancroft at Fort Beau-Séjour in Grand Prix, and also was the co-author with Doug Sobey of Samuel Holland, his work and legacy on Prince Edward Island. Earle is currently working on a book relating to Colonel John Winslow, who carried out the deportation of the Acadians at Grand Prix in Nova Scotia in 1755. Earle has been a frequent contributor to the Island magazine, having contributed only 20 articles over a span of 22 years. His historical articles have also appeared in, among others, Acadians, it's a history magazine produced at the University of New Brunswick. He also published in Les Cahiers, published by the Acadian Historical Society based in Moncton. He published also in the Canadian Journal of Native Studies, published at the University of Brandon, and in the Native Studies Review, published at the University of Saskatchewan. Until 3 years ago, Earle spent 5 months each year at his summer college in Darnley, PEI. He and his wife Heidi now live, as I mentioned, in Sanford, Ontario, and have 2 daughters and 2 grandsons who are also residents in Ontario. So without further ado, let's welcome Earle Lockerby.
Well, thank you very much, George. Is my mic, can people hear me? Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you very much for that introduction. I wish I could say that I was still a summertime resident of PEI, but I'm just happy to be spending 2 months, or 2 weeks. I wish it were 2 months, but it's 2 weeks. So 2 weeks is better than nothing. So it's great to be here. So the deportation of the Acadians from Prince Edward Island is a story that links to one of the exhibits, as Valerie mentioned. And also, it happens to be, I would say, the greatest human disaster that has with human loss of life that has ever been experienced by this island. And it brought the French regime on the island to a cataclysmic end in 1758. So it is an important event in island history. The event in 1758 has been kind of overshadowed by the deportation of the Nova Scotian Acadians in 1755. And there are several reasons, I guess, why this is so. First of all, the event of 1755 in Nova Scotia happened first. It involved about twice as many people being deported as was the case here on Ile Saint-Jean, as the island was called in the French regime. And the 1755 deportation was more controversial than the deportation from the island. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that the deportation of the Nova Scotia Acadians occurred at a time when Britain and France were not officially at war. There were hostilities going on between them, but they were not officially at war. War was declared the following year. And for the Island Acadians, 1758, that deportation happened at the end of the capture of Louisbourg, and certainly the 7 Years' War was in full swing at that time. The other factor which has certainly made the deportation of the Nova Scotia Acadians well known is that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the poet, wrote Evangeline, which is an epic poem, book-length poem, and it was extremely well received and all across the English-speaking world, and then translations into French and other languages. So people got to know the story of Evangeline, which is situated, takes place at Grand Pre in Nova Scotia. So people learned all about that deportation, and we didn't have a Longfellow or equivalent to write about the deportation from Prince Edward Island. So just a bit of a thumbnail sketch to illustrate the environment that led up to the deportation of the Island Acadians, and also the kind of life they were living. The island of St. John, or Ile Saint-Jean, was a dependency of Ile Royale, which is today Cape Breton. So the overall government was from Louisbourg, but there was an administrative unit at Port Lajoie. Settlement began in 1720, and it was based on the fishery. And the initial settlement was by about 300 people who came directly from France, sponsored by a company that was involved in the fishery and had been granted the whole of Ile Saint-Jean. So at that time, a trickle of Acadians started coming here from the mainland, from Nova Scotia. And there were two families that came in 1720, the Acadians Gallant, and the Gallants of Prince Edward Island, generally speaking, are all or most are descended from that initial settler, Michel Acadian Gallant, and his wife, Anne Cormier. And the Martin family also came that year. And from there on, there was a trickle each year, expanding very slowly. And as a result of the influx of Acadians, during the French regime on the island, there was an increasing Acadianization, if you like, of the island, because the immigration directly from France was largely at the very beginning. There was a little bit later, but mostly the increase in population was as a result of Acadians coming here from the mainland. But by 1748, the population of the island was still only about 700 to 800. There was a war in the 1740s called the War of the Austrian Succession between Britain and France, and at the end of that war, peace was re-established, and the French government introduced a policy of trying to encourage immigration to Ile Saint-Jean from Nova Scotia by the Acadians, and that was somewhat successful. They were given support with farm implements and provisions and clothing, things like that. There was also some natural tendency to want to leave Nova Scotia, because there was Halifax was established in 1749, and in the early 1750s we had some forts being built in the Chignecto region: Fort Beauséjour, Fort Gaspereau at Port Elgin, and Fort Lawrence right near the border between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick today. So things were looking a little bit uneasy militarily, and there was good reason to perhaps pull up stakes and move to the island, which seemed to be a safer place. By the 1750s, this trickle had expanded to a fair flow of new immigrants, and the population started rising quite rapidly after 1750. And by 1752, when there was a fairly comprehensive census taken, the population had grown to over 2,000. So this shows, there was a census in 1735, and this shows you where people were living. The administrative center was here at Port des Joie, but the fishery was really based here to Havre Saint-Pierre, which is St. Peter's Harbor. And there was some settlement at Tracadie, some along the Rivière du Nord-Est, which is the Hillsborough River, East Point, really North Lake, really. And up here at Malpeque, there was, there was a settlement. And Malpeque at that time was on the western side of Malpeque Bay, not here where Malpeque is today. Note that there's no settlement yet at Bedeque. So this map is taken from a book by Andrew Hill Clark called 3 Centuries on the Island, and it's I like it in the sense that it shows you kind of the distribution of the population. He's used a small dot to represent 10 persons and a large dot to represent 100, and I think there's only about 4 large dots. There's 3 of them Havre Saint-Pierre and 1 here on the Rivière du Nord-Est. But you can see that the population is largely in the eastern end of the island, but we do have some settlers at Bedeque now, both on the north side of the Dunk River and the south side. And the settlement has increased at Malpeque. Now, one of the problems with this map is that for some reason the author has shown population on this side of, on the east side of Malpeque Bay, and that, there's no evidence that that was ever occurring at that time, so I think that is an error, but otherwise it's a useful map. This map was developed by Georges Arsenault and Samuel Arsenault, and it shows, it's based on the census of 1752, and I like it because it shows all the settlements by name at that time, but I want to draw your attention to the crosses, which are the location of the churches. And each of these churches had its own parish. And there was a parish at Malpeque, and Bedeque was part of the Malpeque parish. So this was all one parish here. And actually there was a portage right about here, so it was not too difficult to move between Bedeque Bay and Malpeque Bay. And that portage was located roughly from where the traffic circle is, the roundabout in Travers Rest, down the road to Reed's Corner, and a little bit beyond into the Wilmot River. So that's where the portage was. And on Samuel Holland's large map, you can see that portage. Here is a part of Samuel Holland's large map. This is the map that came to Prince Edward Island in 2015, I think it was. It was at the Confederation Center Gallery all summer, and I took lots of pictures of it, and I know George and Doug did as well. But this shows the Dunk River, called by the French Rivière de Bedeque. And it's a little bit hard to see from where you're sitting, but there are a series of little red rectangles. You can see some here, a little cluster, some here, and so on. Also on the north side of the river, this would be Lower Bedeque. North Bedeque, down here. This is Lower Bedeque. And by the time of 1758, when the deportation occurred, there were, I think, 12 houses on the south side and 8 on the north side. So there was, whereas in 1752 there were only 4 households on each side of the river. So in the years between 52 and 58 there has been quite a few additional settlers come to Bedeque. So, as I said, the colony was established based on the fishery, and this just shows what the operation might have looked like at Saint-Pierre, because that's where the base, that's where the fishing was done, and the French government actually discouraged fishing from occurring at other settlements because the government wanted to get agriculture going as an industry. So that's not at Saint-Pierre, but it just represents what the fishery might have looked like. That might have been Gaspé or somewhere, I'm not sure where that is. And as I said, the agriculture was being promoted, and the Acadians who came here from Nova Scotia, of course, were quite used to marshland farming, because around the Bay of Fundy and Minas Basin we have pretty high tides. So dikes were an important part of that agriculture. Here on the island, where the tides are much less, there was not so much need for dikes, although there were some dikes built. And there was some upland agriculture as well, such as at Malpeque. But along the Hillsborough River, the Riviera du Nord-Est, there was a lot of marshland. So that's one of the reasons so many people settled in that area. The trading was largely fish, I guess, leaving the island, and it would go to places like Quebec and Louisbourg, where probably then would get, or maybe it would go, or sometimes it went directly from France to here. And things coming in would be the kind of things that the settlers would need and couldn't produce themselves. The deportation in Nova Scotia in 1755 resulted in yet another influx of settlers to Île Saint-Jean, because there were those that didn't get rounded up in Nova Scotia and were able to escape. Some of them came here, so that was another influx. And as a result of some crop failures and the food scarcity resulting from that, the result of plagues of grasshoppers and mice, some years there was a disease which we call rust today, which affects grain. So there were some years where food was in quite short supply, and with the influx of new settlers, there was quite a bit of difficulty with having enough food. So on the eve of the deportation of 1758, we had on the island here a civilian population of about 4,600, and these were largely Acadians with close family ties to extended families who had been in Nova Scotia up until 1755. The places of settlement on the island and in the eve of the deportation were generally the same settlements as in 1752. All the Bedeque, for example, had already been established by around 1750. And there was a garrison at Port Lajoie, a military garrison, administrative personnel, numbering about 100 people. So, everything was about to change. And the reason was that it was in the midst of a war, a 7 Years' War, and Britain sent a very large contingent, military contingent to North America to seize Louisbourg, and which was a major fortress, French fortress, and to capture that fortress. And they sent about 14,000 soldiers and a navy to match. So that was a pretty formidable force. So the operation was under the command of General Geoffrey Amherst. That's him. So Amherst, Nova Scotia, is called after him, and so is Fort Amherst in PEI. And this just shows a painting of Louisbourg at the time of the siege. You see British ships in the harbor. This is Gabarousse Bay. And the town of Louisbourg, which had a wall, a fortress all the way around it. And a bombardment occurred from the British in this area, and also way around Louisbourg Harbor, at the other end of the harbor, over at what's called Lighthouse Point. And this lighthouse was the first lighthouse that was ever built in what is now Canada. The siege was 7 weeks, and on the 26th of July, 1758, the French surrendered. And when that sort of thing happens, and it happened in those days, there was always articles of capitulation were drawn up and negotiated. And when I say negotiated, there wasn't a lot of room for negotiation because the victor got to pretty well say what the terms of capitulation were going to be. However, one of the terms of capitulation was that all the soldiers at Louisbourg, French soldiers, would be sent off to France. Same thing with the garrison at Port La Joie, the French soldiers there. And all the inhabitants of Ile Royale and Ile Saint-Jean would be deported to France. So on August 8th, Amherst gave instructions to a man called Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Rollo. And this is Andrew Rollo, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Rollo, also known as Lord Rollo, Lord Andrew Rollo. So he was a member of the nobility, and I was able to get this photograph from the present Lord Rollo, who was a direct descendant of Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Rollo. So I was quite pleased to have that photograph to be able to use in the book and also at the book launch. And it's not a photograph that people had seen before, so it was kind of special. So the instructions that Rollo received from Amherst were to proceed to Ile Saint-Jean with 4 transports. Transports are just ships for transporting soldiers or people. With some British soldiers and materials to accept the surrender of the garrison at Port La Joie, to place the French soldiers aboard the transports, round up the inhabitants, put them on the transports, build a fort at Port La Joie, and man it, return to Louisbourg with the transports. So Rollo arrives at Port La Joie via Canso Strait on August 17th. And the arrival of the British troops on the island had been anticipated because word had gotten from Ile Royale to Ile Saint-Jean as to what was going on. So some of the residents of Ile Saint-Jean had the opportunity to escape before the British soldiers arrived. This is an illustration which is intended to denote refugees escaping or fleeing along a river to get to some point where they can gather, where there would be a schooner that they could get on and to flee from the island. Actually, this illustration is from Evangeline, the book I mentioned, but from a British edition. And there was a British illustrator who I don't think knew very much about Acadian clothing, because this to me looks like a Puritan minister here, and these look like society ladies in their finery. So I don't think there's too much realism there on the costumes. But anyway, you get the idea. This is a lot more realistic. Now this start illustrating other Acadians going along the shore, probably to escape the British and to get to some schooner perhaps where they could leave the island. And the dress there, I think you would agree that the chap who's leading the oxen, his dress looks much more like I would anticipate the Acadians were dressed. So here's the schooner, and so a fair number of people were able to flee from the island and get to the mainland. So there were a number of parallel activities occurring at once. There were people fleeing. The French soldiers were arrested. That would have been pretty easy for the British to do at Port La Joie. And then the arrest of the civilian population began. And we know quite a bit about what occurred because of Rollo's letters to his superiors, and also the log or the journal of the of the ship which was the escort, the naval ship which was the escort for these 4 transports that came over. It was called the Hind, and the captain was Captain Robert Bond, and so there's quite a detailed log which describes day by day what's going on. So we know that boats were sent up the Riviere to Nord-Est, for example. We know about the construction of Fort Amherst, and there was a rudimentary French fort at Fort Lejeune before the British came. It had been built some years earlier, and it was quite close to where Fort Amherst was built. And here you see Fort Amherst as it looks today, and you can see Charlottetown over here, and Charlottetown Harbor. So the first wave, if you like, of the deportation from Ile Saint-Jean was with these 4 transports. They got them fully loaded, and aboard these transports was the garrison, about 100 soldiers. The commandant of the French garrison, Gabriel Mousseau de Villejoin. There were 2 priests, Biscaret and Cassiette. Biscaret was from Havre Saint-Pierre, and Cassiette was the priest of the parish along the Hillsborough River. The church was right near where Scottsford is today. And the reason they were allowed on these boats, or put on these boats, to go, was specifically they wanted to try to persuade Amherst to rescind the order that the Acadians on the island would be deported. So there's no record of any discussions that they had, so we know that they weren't successful, and that's to be expected. I think it was a pretty long shot. So there were about almost 700 settlers loaded on those transports, and they left on August 31st. They arrived at Louisbourg fairly soon after, September 4th. And when the Acadians on these transports arrived in Louisbourg, they were transferred to quite a large ship called the Mary, and it sailed off for France, destined to France, on September 27th. So one thing that Rollo and the British grossly underestimated was the population of the island. They had no idea, and obviously they thought that they were going to get everybody on 4 ships. So the French authorities at Louisbourg would have certainly known with the population. They could have told the British, but why should they? You know, why should they make things easier for the British? But there was another side to the coin, though, because because the British had to kind of find that out the hard way and then respond by getting more vessels. Well, quite a bit of time was lost, and by the time, as you'll see later, by the time that all the vessels and all the Acadians that they were able to get onto the vessels left, it was much later in the season, which meant that the risk of bad weather crossing the Atlantic was greater, and we'll be talking about that later. So there was by not alerting to the British in the situation, there was a downside. So Rollo's still on PEI. The 4 ships have gone back to Louisbourg, and with instructions to send more transports. Okay, so that request would have gone to this man. This is Edward Boscawen. He was in charge of the naval forces for the siege of Louisbourg, sometimes referred to as Wry-necked Dick, because of the habit of having his head cocked to one side, and sometimes there's another name for him, can't really recall, but he seemed to acquire nicknames for some reason. So, request was made for 14 more transports to be provisioned for 2 months and dispatched to Ile Saint-Jean. And that they were deemed to be adequate for 3,542 passengers. So all of these transports, again with the Hind, as the escort ship, departed for Port Lejeune on September 14th. And we know a good deal about those vessels. We know their names, we know the captains, we know their tonnage of them, the size of the ships. And The biggest one was the Parnassus at 425 tons. And I've marked the Duke William, the Ruby, and the Violet in bold letters because we're going to be talking more about them later. They stand out, and you'll see why. Just continuing, I've ordered these more ships. I've ordered these put them in the order of descending size. So the smallest one, the Restoration, at 177 tons. So Louisbourg is about here. This is Ile Royale, by the way, and the mainland was closer here. This is the Strait of Canso. The French called it the Passage de Fronsac. And here's the eastern end of Ile Saint-Jean. So the ships were coming down through here and through the Strait of Canso and then over to Port Lajoie. It took a lot longer to get these ships to Port Lajoie than the first 4 transports. They had gone fairly quickly, but so I believe that there must have been adverse winds. The Strait of Canso is quite narrow, so if you got adverse winds, it's kind of hard to get through. They probably had to wait until conditions were right. Anyway, these 4 transports did get to Port Lajoie, and they even ordered another 3 transports, one of which was called the Richard and Mary, and I'll be talking about it a bit later. So the roundup of the Acadians began, or I should say resumed, when these transports got to Port Lajoie, and it continued through October and into early November. And from the correspondence that exists in the log of the Hind, we know, again, some detail. For example, on October 14th, 50 settlers from Point Prim, or Point Prim, as we say it in English, were brought to Port Lajoie. On October 15th, longboats were sent up the Rivière de Nord-Est, and on October 20th, there were some captains, including Father Gerard. He was the priest at Point Prim, and they were put aboard ship. So we have kind of a running commentary, a running story of the Acadians being put on the vessels. So this just is intended to depict, I guess, what it might have felt like or looked like for people inside when the British soldiers were approaching. I always think this youth looks concerned to me, and I would say that this little guy is defiant and scornful, maybe. He's not very happy about the situation and showing it in the way he's looking. Not all of the Acadians went willingly aboard. I think at least this illustration is sort of intended to show a little bit of resistance on the part of an Acadian male. Needed a little bit of persuasion, perhaps, to be pulled aboard the boats that would take the refugees out to the ships. Again, this is an illustration that comes from that British version of Evangeline. So I don't think the dress is quite appropriate, but it sort of makes a point kind of nicely. So as the roundup continued, we get reports that they're going to superiors and so on, and the numbers keep increasing. They're up to 1,600, then we're up to 2,000, 2,150, 2,200, and finally 2,415. And this does not include the previous batch that were sent over in the 4 transports earlier on, which were 692. Now there's one individual that got deported by the name of Felix Leblanc, and he had and his family had been settled at Chignecto, and he took part in the siege of Fort Beauséjour in 1755, which immediately preceded the deportation of the Acadians over there. So he got deported from Chignecto to South Carolina, and he and his family made their way back the following year, 1756, came to Ile Saint-Jean and got deported to France from Ile Saint-Jean. So he got deported twice. However, he had a daughter by the name of Marie Blanche, and she suffered experienced the same deportations that her father did, namely Chignecto to South Carolina, Ile Saint-Jean to France, but she experienced 2 more deportations, so 4 in total. And I think it was 1773 she was deported from Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon to France, and later on she made her way back to Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, and then later got deported to Boston from Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon. So 4 times. I think she's the only Acadian that got deported 4 times. This is a painting by an artist called Lewis Parker, and it's the only painting or illustration we have that is specifically Port Bourgeois or Ile Saint-Jean. So it was painted specifically with research being done on the deportation here to before the artist actually created it. So a number of the images that I've been using relate to the deportation in Nova Scotia or maybe some other aspect of Acadian life. But this is a painting that is intended to depict Port Bourgeois. So you see the Acadians being rounded up by the British, put in boats, and take them out to the transports. And that's the picture that's on the cover of my book, the English version of the book. So, as I mentioned earlier, not everybody got captured. Some people were able to flee. And Rollo actually reported about this in one of his letters to his superiors. And he wrote that numbers of Acadians have fled to Canada, meaning the mainland, Canada being what we would call New Brunswick today, and have carried off great quantities of cattle by means of 4 schooners, which ply from Malpeque, to the continent. Ye is the abbreviation for the, used sometimes in the 17th century. So the inhabitants of Malpeque, on the west side of Malpeque Bay, did not get deported. They managed to all escape. And some islanders and other places managed to escape as well, not only before the British troops arrived, but probably after. And the captain of the Hind, the escort vessel, wrote that on October 12th, he wrote that there was trouble in getting some of the inhabitants to submit, which means come in and allow themselves to be taken into custody. The escapees went to Miramichi and to Chaleur Bay. So, if we try to roughly account for the population and the number deported and so on and so on, the estimate of the population upon the time of Rollo's arrival was 4,350, of which about 100 were the garrison. So that leaves 4,250. The number deported was about 3,100. Again, the 100 is the soldiers, the French soldiers. So about 3,000 Acadians deported. And it's estimated maybe about 1,100 managed to flee. And tradition says that about 150 remained on the island. Now, we don't have definitive sources that give us, documented information, but tradition does say that some did remain, maybe as many as 150. So the operations for the collecting the Acadians completed by the end of October, and at the beginning of November they're preparing to depart for France. Fort Amherst has been built, and a garrison of 100 British soldiers have been left behind at Fort Amherst. So on November 4th, the Hind leaves Port Bourgeois with 15 transports convoying these transports. And 2 of these transports contained British soldiers who were being taken back to Louisbourg. So this just is intended to show the convoy of the ships on their way. And they, again, went back through the Strait of Canso, and they ran into some major problems. Gales, fall gales. The largest one, the Parnassus, was driven ashore and stranded and abandoned. Another vessel grounded but was refloated. Another one, the Richard Mary, which had soldiers aboard, hit a submerged rock and sank. And fortunately there was no loss of life, but what they had to do was redistribute the passengers. I mean, 2 of the vessels were no longer usable, so they had to take the passengers from those and put them in the other vessels. So the number of transports carrying Acadians got reduced from 13 to 11. And this gale did some damage to the rigging of the vessels and depleted their provisions, their food stores. So as a result of that, it was decided that these vessels would not go directly to France. They would go to England first in order to take on additional provisions, because there were, everything had gotten slowed down. They were low on provisions, and they needed to get their rigging repaired. And with a country at war, France was at war with Britain, so it's going to be kind of hard to get provisions and get your vessel fixed in France. So they decided to go first to England and get these things attended to, and then take the passengers to France. So the vessels were traveling under what's called a cartel arrangement, and that simply means that it's an agreement between warring parties or warring countries which is intended to allow safe passage of prisoners of war, refugees, and so on. And at sea, ships would denote that they're traveling under cartel by flying maybe a white flag or some kind of a special flag. So that's the basis on which they set out. But because of storms on the Atlantic, they soon got separated, and they were no longer a convoy. And the ships did experience a series of storms, which, as I say, separated them, and must have caused a lot of heartache and sickness and difficulty for the refugees who were aboard them. But a number of them reached England in late December, and they didn't all get in one port. They ended up in several ports: Plymouth, Biddeford, Portsmouth. And these particular 3 vessels took 3 to 4 weeks to get across the Atlantic. So here's Plymouth, which is one of them. One to Plymouth, another one to Portsmouth. Biddeford is up here. I'm just going to show you a few other points because I'll be talking about them. Land's End, which is in Cornwall, is right way down here, and Penzance is close by. In France, we have St. Malo here, which is where the Acadians were supposed to be taken. And up here is another French town or city called Boulogne. And we'll be talking a bit more about that in a moment. So this is just a shot of Plymouth in those times. And that is Portsmouth. And I mentioned Boulogne. The first vessel to actually reach France was the Neptune, and it didn't get to St. Malo. It got driven by storms up the English Channel, almost as far as Belgium, and decided to go into the port of Boulogne, and it discharged its Acadians there. And the Tamerlan, which is another vessel, it arrived at the first one in St. Malo on January 16th, and then on the 23rd of January, a whole bunch of them came in. 5 vessels came in. And then way back into March, the one that had gone to Biddeford came in, the Supply. And her passengers had been aboard for 4.5 months. And what was going on between the time they arrived at Biddeford and the time they arrived at St. Malo, I don't know. But it's a long time. There are passenger lists for the arrivals at St. Malo, and they've been a boon to genealogists. Not only do they give quite a bit of information about the Acadians who debarked at St. Malo, but they also give information about the Acadians who died at sea. And there were quite a few that died at sea, as we'll see momentarily, a lot. So that information is all available, and as I say, it has been very valuable to genealogists of Acadian families. It could be that there may be information in British newspapers at the time which would shed light on what was going on with the supply, for example, during that hiatus of 4.5 months. And at the time I was doing the research for this book, you couldn't access British newspapers on the internet like you can today. So that would be something that someone might want to undertake sometime, see if we can fill in some of the more details. This is Boulogne, I guess. Yeah, and then this is St. Malo. This is the harbor of St. Malo. So some of the vessels have arrived in England and some have then gone on to France, but not all. Several of the vessels really hit very badly by the storms. And we know quite a bit about one of them, called the Duke William, because the captain, who was his name was Nichols, gave a very detailed account after his vessel sank, and so we know a lot about what led up to it, the days, the days leading up to the sinking, and the valiant efforts that were made to prevent the vessel from sinking, and what the Acadians helping to bail the water out, and so on and so on. So there's a we know, and another one that sank was the Violet. And these two vessels sank about 30 leagues off of Land's End in Cornwall. And together, between the two, they started out with about 700 passengers on them. So the Violet sank on December 12th with all passengers being drowned. And the Duke William and another one called the Ruby also foundered at sea. And this account that Captain Nichols gave, captain of the Duke William, he said that when it became obvious that the vessel was going to sink, that the Acadians had approached him and begged him to save himself, save his crew, and to save Father Gerard. So we know that the crew launched 2 boats, and all of the crew made it to Cornwall. And it was later learned that after the crew had left the vessel, some Acadians managed to get another small boat that was on the Duke William before it sank. They got it launched, and 4 male passengers, 4 Acadians, managed to get to Cornwall. But in all, the number of people saved from the vessel was only 40, which is less than 15% of the total number of people on the vessel. And almost all of that 40 were crew members. This is a letter that Captain Nichols sent to the Admiralty to explain that he had lost the Duke William. That's page 1 of the letter. He wrote that from Penzance after he got on land. And it's dated December 16, 1758. So the Duke William sank on the 13th of December, and beginning a number of years ago, the practice began here on the island of having a ceremony at the National Historic Site, Skamogin, Port Lejeune, Port Amherst. And every year on December 13th, there's a remembrance of the loss of life by the sinking of these vessels. The Ruby was the third one to go down. About January 20th, it had got as far as the Azores. The Azores is a volcanic archipelago of islands in the Atlantic, about 1,400 miles west of Portugal. They belong to Portugal. And the captain, Captain William Kelly, felt that his vessel was about to sink. It was taking in water. So his strategy was to run it aground on on an island in the Azores, and the island that it got run aground on was called Pico. And it had left Port Royal with 310 passengers, and of that number, 120 were saved, and the 23 crew members were also saved. So there was substantial loss of life there with the Acadians on the Ruby. This is the island of Pico, and you can see it's pretty rugged. You can see all these contour lines culminating in a peak here. So it's a pretty rocky, rugged island. And here in the background, this is Pico. See the tall peak there? And this shot is taken from the island of Fayal, which is another island in the Azores. And Fayal was the island that Captain Kelly was trying to make. I don't know whether he was closer to it or whatever, but maybe he knew it was more favorable to grounding a vessel. Anyway, so that was more loss of life. However, drowning wasn't the only thing that caused a lot of Acadians to lose their lives in the deportation. And the other thing, besides drowning, was shipborne disease. Things like typhus, cholera, dysentery. And at those times, these kind of shipborne diseases were pretty common, particularly in vessels which were holding a lot of people, such as naval vessels, or vessels in which large numbers of people were being transported. The fact that there was insufficient food and bad food, perhaps on the vessels, may have been contributing factors to the illness. And to be fair, some of the passengers were probably not in good health when they started the trip from Port Royal because of malnutrition that had been occurring in Île Saint-Jean. Aboard the Mary, which was the ship that the first contingent of Acadians who left the island were taken over to Louisbourg, and I mentioned earlier they were transferred to the Mary, which was quite a large vessel. Aboard that vessel, 255 of 560 passengers died, and a lot of those were children. So the deportation from Île Saint-Jean resulted in the decimation of many families. We can say that the deportation from Nova Scotia in 1755 resulted in huge disruption of families and separations and so on, but the one from Île Saint-Jean resulted in the decimation in the sense that many died. Of the 3,000 or so deported, the number that died by drowning is estimated to be 658, or about 22%. The number who died from disease is even greater, estimated to be 862, or 29%. So together, drowning and disease, half of the people who were put aboard the ships died before they got to their destination. And many more died after they got to their destination in France because of the disease that they had contracted on the ships, and just the illness that had created. So they were in poor state of health when they landed. So more died in the months following their arrival in France. One doctor observed that the number of seamen who died in time of war by shipwreck, famine, capture, famine, fire, and sword are all but inconsiderable in respect of such that are destroyed by the ship diseases and the usual maladies of intemperate climate. So that comment is applying to seamen, but it also applies to civilians who were put aboard ships and in cramped conditions. Now, this is kind of changing tone here a bit. This is perhaps the most notable, the notable person deported from Île Saint-Jean who made it to France. And his name is Pierre Douville. And he was born at Havre Saint-Pierre, St. Peter's Harbor, his father was Francois Duville, and Francois Duville came to the island directly from France in 1719, which is 1 year before the major settlement of the island began. And when he is considered to be the earliest European settler on Ile Saint Jean. And he married a lady from Quebec. So having come directly from France and marrying a lady from Quebec, strictly speaking, Pierre Duville was not an Acadian. But he has a number of distinctions. He is the only individual that we know of who was on Ile Saint Jean prior to 1758, for whom we have a portrait. So we know what he looked like. And after he got to France, he got involved in the French Navy. And as you know, during the American Revolution, the French were allies of the Americans. And so he participated in the French Navy against the British in North America, against the British in what's now the U.S. during the Revolutionary War. And he actually married, at the age of 33, he married a girl from Rhode Island who was 18 at the time. And so he participated not only in the Revolutionary War, American Revolutionary War, he also was involved in the French Revolution, and he died of wounds that he sustained during the battle in the French Revolution. So he's sort of an unusual character and sort of unique among the residents of Ile Saint Jean who got deported. There's, over the years, a lot of mythology has grown up about the deportation of the Acadians in Ile Saint Jean. For example, you can find books which will tell you that the British burned the Acadian houses, the churches, and the barns, and that they were, the officials, like Rollo, were ordered by Amherst to do that. The crops and livestock were destroyed, and the transports were unduly and scandalously overcrowded, which helped to, I suppose, cause more disease aboard ship and so on. And more things such as it was criminal to dispatch ships so late in the season. Well, to be fair, often ships would leave Louisbourg to go to France in the middle of the winter, and every year there would be ships from Quebec City that would leave Quebec City in late fall before freeze-up of the St. Lawrence River, heading for France, and by the time they'd get to the Atlantic it would be November or December. So it was not uncommon at all to be crossing the Atlantic. Mind you, the chances of running into storms is greater. These transports were decrepit and unseaworthy. There's never been any evidence to back that up. Sound ships will sink when they get into storms, if the storms are bad enough. Another thing that you'll read is the fugitives who remained on the island. Now, I suggested that earlier 150. Perhaps they remained hidden in the woods, hiding in the woods until 1763, when peace was restored between Britain and France. And certainly we know that some Acadians who were on the islands in a year or two after the deportation were getting rations from the soldiers at Fort Amherst. So they certainly weren't hiding in the woods until 1763. And the story goes that all of today's Acadians are descended from those few that hid in the woods until 1763. So the fact of the matter is that most of the Acadians today on the island are descended from Acadians who left the island, who fled the island, to places like Miramichi and Shore Bay, and then later came back to the island and resettled on the island again. As far as the burning of the buildings is concerned, Rollo stated in writing that he did not burn the buildings. The Holland survey, the Holland map, shows all these houses, and they were still existing when Holland did his survey in 1765, 64, 65, and drew his map. And there's other evidence that indicates that the churches were standing until 1768 or even later. And some of this particular mythology probably comes from the deportation in Nova Scotia, because in Nova Scotia, a lot of the homes were burned at Chignecto and many places, Grand Pré. So it's easy to extrapolate experience elsewhere, but it's not accurate. As far as the overcrowding is concerned, by today's standards, sure, the vessels were quite overcrowded, but they were not overcrowded for the standards of the time. And again, this myth of overcrowding perhaps comes from the Nova Scotia deportation, because there, Governor Lawrence, Nova Scotia governor, ordered Moncton and John Winslow and the other people who were responsible for implementing the deportation at Grand Pré and at Annapolis Royal, Chignecto, and Pisiquid, which is Windsor. They were ordered to put 2 passengers per ton of capacity on the vessels, and that's quite overcrowding. And some of the vessels in 1755 were more than 2 people per ton of capacity. However, for Ile Saint-Jean, the 13 transports leaving Port de Juan had a ratio of 0.7 passengers per ton. That got bumped up to 0.8 because of the redistribution of passengers, where 2 vessels got lost and 3 canceled. And compare, and you can look at the ratios for British immigration to this part of the world. The Annabelle came to PEI, so my ancestors were on that. In 1770, the ratio there, 0.8. The Edinburgh came to Princetown the year after, 0.9. Again, Chief Justice Peter Stewart was on that vessel, the Edinburgh. And the year before, the same vessel had gone to Carolina with passengers, and we know the number and so on. So the ratio was 0.9. The Hector, the famous Hector, bringing Scottish settlers to Pictou, the ratio was 1. And for a vessel that came to PEI in 1832, which is a long time after the deportation, the ratio was 0.7. So although by today's standards the ships were quite overcrowded, they were not overcrowded by the standards of the day. So the Acadian deportation is a very gloomy story in Canadian history. Not just the deportation from Ile Saint-Jean, but the deportation of Acadians generally. And there were a series of deportations that lasted from 1755 to 1762. So not just the 2 that I've been talking about tonight. They were the major ones, but there were smaller ones as well. So despite it being a gloomy chapter, we can say that there's a much happier chapter today. And we can say that the British conquerors were unable to quell the Acadian spirit. We can say that subsequent chapters speak to regrouping and a new beginning, new hope. An Acadian community was reestablished on Ile Saint-Jean, and over time that community has thrived and has prospered. And a strong sense of pride has emerged, and a rich culture has blossomed. And my last slide, today's reality is that close to 25% of the islanders derived from Acadian stock. Acadian culture enriches the culture of PEI as a whole, and Acadians are an integral and important part of PEI's economic, political, religious, and cultural fabric. So happy to take questions if, yes?
Is it true that the Acadians were given opportunity to swear allegiance to the British Crown and to remain on their land, and that they didn't want to because they might be forced to fight against their own?
Yes, in Nova Scotia, that was one of the major issues that resulted in the Acadians in Nova Scotia being deported in 1755. They, early on, after the Treaty of Utrecht was in 1713, where Nova Scotia became British for the last time. Acadia had kind of gone back and forth between the French and the British a number of times in the 17th century. But after Nova Scotia became British permanently, the Acadians took an oath of allegiance, but it was not a full oath. They pledged allegiance to the king, but they wanted to be neutral in terms of military. They were not prepared to bear arms because they didn't want to bear arms against their compatriots, the French. And there was concern about the Mi'kmaq. The Mi'kmaq were quite anti-British at that time, and the Acadians didn't want to get themselves, in between the British and the Mi'kmaq. So their situation was quite complicated, and the British tolerated the situation for several decades. But then once Halifax was founded and new governors came, first Cornwallis and then Charles Lawrence, they were much more stringent and hard-nosed, I guess, than previous British administrators had been, less lenient. So they started to put the squeeze on the Acadians to take a full oath of allegiance, and the Acadians were not prepared to do so. But that never was an issue in Prince Edward Island, in Ile Saint Jean. I suppose it became an issue, or well, it became something that had to be addressed after Acadians started coming back to Nova Scotia and Ile Saint Jean, because by that time land had gotten portioned out to English landlords, and for Acadians to come back and get settled and kind of regularized, they did have to take an oath, and by that time they were prepared to take a full oath. Is that right, George?
Just on that, wasn't there some that went from Louisbourg to Quebec City and fought for the British?
You're talking about the Plains of Abraham?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, there were Acadians that fought for the
And then
French.
they came back to Prince Edward Island getting their land because of their loyalty to General Wolfe.
No. There were Acadians that fought for the French at Plains of Abraham, okay? But they were Acadians that had made their way to Quebec after having got deported from Nova Scotia in 1755. They got deported to the American colonies, but some of them made their way back to Nova Scotia and some to Quebec. So some Acadians fought on the French side in the Plains of Abraham. I'm not aware of Acadians going directly from Ile Royale to Quebec to participate in anything.
Balthazar Matart,
Yes.
who is technically probably not an Acadian but came from France,
Yep.
had been in Louisbourg, and as I understand, went to pledged allegiance to General Wolfe, fought for General Wolfe, then because of his loyalty came to PEI.
Yeah. Yeah. He was on PEI and went to Quebec from PEI along with some other settlers here on the island who were not strictly Acadians. They had come from places like Alsace in France. Okay. Okay. So, and some of them, there was one by the name of Horn, Jacob Horn, and they had deserted places like Lunenburg, because Lunenburg was settled by Germans. Okay. During the time of Cornwallis, and there were always people who would defect or change sides. So, and those were German people. So some of them came to Ile Saint Jean before 1758. So some of these people ended up before the deportation from Ile Saint Jean in Quebec. And yes, some of them I think fought. So it's quite credible to me that Plutarch could have fought for the British. There were some, things were so bad on the island in the 1750s with regard to food and so on, that the administration at Port McGraw actually shipped off some islanders to Quebec, some of the Acadians on the island to Quebec, simply to relieve the pressure here of food being scarce and to give them the, I think the ones that got shipped off probably tend to be the ones that couldn't work, the older people. Yeah.
Do you know if there's any, did you ever come across any records from the French ports that accepted the Acadians as to their reaction to these Acadians sort of being deposited? Do you think?
Their reaction to being deported?
No, the French, the people in France who were receiving the Acadians. Do you think there's any records that might exist?
Oh yeah, there's lots of records of Acadians. There's even been books written about the Acadians in France. The French government, to some degree, exploited the Acadians who ended up there because they were wanting to develop plantations in Guadeloupe and Martinique and places like that, French colonies where they wanted to develop, and they wanted colonists, so they encouraged some of the people who had been deported to France to go to these places. And they didn't adapt well to hot climates and so on, and more of them died in places like that. So to some degree they were exploited by the French government, but on the other hand they were also given some financial support, you know, and that financial support lasted right into the 1790s for some of them.
Was there any kind of exchange for taking the Acadians to France, or did the British get something in return?
They were supposed to pick up, once they got discharged their load of refugees in France, they were supposed to pick up some British prisoners of war and take them to England. But I don't think it happened for some reasons. I'm not quite sure what they were, but I think there was some intent for that to happen, but I don't think it did.
Question there.
Do you know what percent of Nova Scotians derive from Acadian stock?
Say that again, please?
Do you know what percent of Nova Scotians derive from Acadian stock? You're concluding that 25% of PEI Islanders derive.
What fraction? George might be better positioned to answer that. I don't know. I would think it's less, to be quite honest, but I'm just guessing. New Brunswick's very high, as you know. New Brunswick is would be at least 50%.
No. 35?
35?
40%?
Yeah, my guess with Nova Scotia would be less than PEI, but I don't know. I'm just guessing.
And the 25% on the island is people who, in a sense, will say that at least one of their ancestors was Acadian or French. So you could be a McDowell for 3 generations, but your great-grandmother was Acadian. You can't identify yourself as an Acadian. So 25% is of islanders who have some Acadian or French blood.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe who can answer this better, but, sorry, my mask on. The homesteads around Bedeque here and the Acadians who were here, is there any evidence left of them at all, of any of the foundations or the homesteads that were here? Has any archaeological dig been done in this area, or?
I don't think there's been any archaeology as such done, but I wouldn't be surprised if the earlier settlers, British settlers, would have seen remains of cellars and so on. There has been archaeological work done at the Malpeque settlement on some of the basements and so on.
You have to remember that the Acadians came here, the first ones on the Long River was around 1750, so they were only here for 8 years. They didn't have time to clear too much land. More came. I'd like to just give a little bit of information, because often people hear that Acadians were deported to Louisiana because of other Cajuns. But there's not one Acadian that was deported to Louisiana. The first Acadians that went to Louisiana were a small group that had been deported to the American colonies, and after the Treaty of Paris of 1763, went to Louisiana. But the biggest contingent of Acadians who went to Louisiana went from France in 1785, about 1,500 of them, I believe, after living in France for between 1759 and 85. And many of them were people who had lived, or their parents had lived on the island for a number of years. In fact, one year I got a call from a Mr. Guillat. He was coming to the island with a group, and he had done his genealogy, and his ancestor had been deported to France, and later on, 1785, ended up settling in Louisiana. So he knew that his ancestor had lived around Point Prim, and he wanted to know if I knew where his land was. So I had never heard about the Guillat, and I did some research. And a number of years after, I went to Louisiana, and he invited me to give a talk about the Acadians of Prince Edward Island at a Lions Club dinner, I think, I forget, something like that. From those that were deported from the island in 1758, there's only 2 families that came back and remained permanently on the island. That would be Alexis Doiron, the ancestor of all the Doirons on the island, and the other one was a Longuepie family. Longuepie, who still have some descendants, but their name has been anglicized to Longuepie, mainly in Kings County. A few others came back from France, but then left for Cape Breton or the Mandarin Islands or other places. But there's two families that remained here.
Most of the Acadians that ended up in France came from Ile Saint-Jean, but there were some others that did not. Because in the deportation of 1755, I think it was one of the Carolinas, I'm not sure whether it was North Carolina or South Carolina. No, or was it Georgia? I'm not sure. But one of those American colonies was unprepared to accept the Acadians that were sent to that colony, whereas others like Massachusetts and Philadelphia and Rhode Island and so on, they accepted the Acadians. It was a fait accompli. Lawrence sent a letter to these governors saying, dumping all these Acadians on your doorstep. So they weren't very happy about it, and one of the colonies said no. So they sent them all to England. The ones that didn't get accepted, it was North Carolina, whatever, they were shipped off to England, and they were kept in detention in England until the end of the 7 Years' War, 1763. And then they got sent to France. So the ones that ended up in France are from here, as well as some that got deported in 1735 to the southern states, but weren't accepted, sent to England, and then got sent to France. Yeah.
I'm with the Farmers Bank Museum, Doucette House Museum in Rustico. And
Yeah.
we have the oldest structure in Prince Edward Island built by John Doucette's family when they returned.
And you're
A little louder.
Okay, I'm from the Farmers Bank and Doucette House Museum in Rustico. And there we have the oldest structure in Prince Edward Island. It's 250 years old this year, built by Jean Doucette and his family.
Yeah.
And they fled from Malpec, and they went to St. Pierre and Miquelon. From there over to Cheticamp, and then from there to Prince Edward Island in about 1771, building the house in 1772. Now, when they left Malpec, would they have been aboard those 4 transports? Were they owned by local people, or were they transports from other places?
Well, they would have been among the people that escaped.
Yes.
Yeah.
They escaped, you said in 4 schooners, I used transport, I should have said schooners. Those 4 schooners, would they have been owned by the people in Malpec, or would they be
Oh,
owned?
the 4 that Rollo refers to?
Yes,
Yeah, they would be owned by Acadians.
So Jean Bizet and the family could have left in their own schooner then, but they.
Yeah, they could have.
Well, with others, there were a number of,
Yeah.
Jugas, and they would carry people to the mainland, and that's what happened to Doucette. And they came back to the island around 1762, and then in 65, there were a group that went to the island of Miquelon came back to France by the Treaty of Paris, and they stayed there for a while. Then when Britain got to Schitzkashin, so was on the family yet, went to Ile Madame, and from Ile Madame came to rest.
Quite a few Acadians had, a fair number had schooners. We talked about all these Acadians coming to Ile Saint Jean particularly in the 1750s. And they came from places like Cocan and Tadmagouche, and they were ferried, including livestock, across the strait by often Acadian schooners that were owned by Acadians, a variety of Acadians. And the documentation, for some of that exists.
We also mentioned that those families who were living here on the Dunk River, most of them were deported. Many died during the crossing. There's only one or two families that some of their children remained in Acadia, in maritime provinces. But I did the research through genealogy, and it's clear that many of them died during the crossing and ended up in France, and probably someone to Louisiana, I think.
The fourth poster in the series up there in the museum wall that Doug put together, Doug talks about the deportation of the Acadians from Bedeque. And he talks about three families in particular, the Lejeune, the Thibauts, Thibodeaux, and Robichaud. And the Lejeunes, and they were on the north side of the river, most of them disappeared and are believed to have died on ships, although at least one made it to France. And so for the other two families, a kind of mixed bag. Some died, some escaped, some made it to France. I would encourage you, when you have time, to read the posters that Doug had put together. One of them, the fourth one, does talk in some detail about what happened. Of course, our knowledge of what happened to them, the Bedeque ones, is pretty fragmentary because we don't even know the name of, there's gaps in our knowledge of the names of those that came after the census of 1752. We know the number of houses from Holland's map. We know that quite growth in the number of people here in Bedeque, but we don't know their names. Whereas for 1752, we know their names, we know the wife's maiden name, we know how many kids, the kids' names, how many acres they sold, a lot of information, but we don't have that kind of information for those that came later. But we do have some information about what happened to those that were here in 1752.
I have a question I'm just puzzled by. On the crossings, many died from diseases and whatever reason, malnutrition, all of that. But drownings, how did they die by drownings on the crossings?
Ship sank.
Oh, okay. I was thinking. Good question. That was puzzling me.
Do you know what happened to the survivors of the Ruby? Did they stay in the Azores or did they go?
No, they got taken to maybe Portugal first. England first, yeah, that's right.
I have a question on, when they had suffered all this, they were in a terrible crossing. The ones who survived and got there, was there help leading them?
In France?
Yes.
Well, some. I'm sure the French did what they could, but there's probably not enough. It never is. It's great today. But yes, they received help. Probably insufficient.
In the first years, the government wanted to settle them inland, and separate them. The families, those Acadian communities, or families want to stay together. And many thought that they would be able to come back because it had happened when the first time that Louisbourg was taken in 45, the population was deported to France, and then later on they came back to Cape Breton. And so they thought that they would be coming back. And some of the men, we know that through some documents, that the Acadian young men didn't want to marry French girls because they said, when we'll be able to go back to Acadia, to Acadie, maybe they won't want to come. So, and they had to get permission from the bishops to marry second or third cousins that were in France with them. There's some very interesting documents that we found.
Yeah, this is one question. What were the First Nation people doing while all this was happening? Or
We don't
is
have.
this a myth that they might have helped the Acadians escape? or-
Well, first, in 1758, during the time that the Acadians were being rounded up, one of Rollo's letters does mention that the Mi'kmaq Indians, was the word he used, were helping the people up at Malpac. Okay.
So that did happen.
And then, if you can go ask Mr. Lockerby questions afterwards, I think somebody's restless here, so it's been very interesting. So I'm going to give Earle on this